When Alex Monroe received the news that their grandfather had passed, it came with a surprising and bittersweet revelation that he had left behind a stretch of land, 5 acres nestled just beyond the manicured hedges and guard gates of the Pine Grove Estates Homeowners Association. The property was a mix of dense trees, wild grass, and an old barn that had seen better days. It wasn't much by commercial standards, but to Alex, it was something more than real estate. It was the last living trace of a man who had taught them how to fish, how to whittle a stick into a toy, and how to stand firm against bullies. The land wasn't just a patch of earth, it was history, memory, and inheritance all bound together. Yet, from the first day Alex stepped foot on the property after the funeral, something didn't feel quite right. There were tire tracks in the mud where no vehicle should have been, and a strange hum of machinery in the air. It wasn't long before a neighbor passing by whispered, "You better keep an eye on that HOA. They've been sniffing around here for years." That strange hum soon turned into something more sinister. One early morning, as the mist clung to the blades of wild grass and the birds chirped with sleepy indifference, Alex stumbled upon the unmistakable grind and roar of industrial drills. A trio of workers in unmarked uniforms stood over what could only be described as a crude drilling operation. Metal pipes driven deep into the earth, tanks and hoses scattered like a battlefield of water extraction. None of them made eye contact. None of them answered Alex's questions. One simply muttered, "Talk to the HOA." Furious and confused, Alex demanded they stop, but their only response was a smirk and the distant rumble of another truck pulling in more equipment. That night, Alex pored through county records and land deeds, trying to make sense of what legal grounds, if any, these strangers had. But there was nothing recent. The property was free and clear. It was supposed to be theirs. When Alex confronted the Pine Grove Estates HOA the next day, they were met with the stony composure of Margaret Wilson, the HOA president, a woman with ice-blue eyes and a voice that barely concealed disdain. "Mr. Monroe," she said, lacing his name with condescension, "this is a community emergency. The county is experiencing unprecedented drought conditions. We are operating under a clause, an old easement your grandfather signed decades ago." She handed over a brittle copy of a yellowed document, barely legible in parts, but bearing the telltale signature of Alex's grandfather. "It gives us limited access in times of crisis," she said sweetly. But Alex couldn't help but notice the luxurious state of Pine Grove, green lawns, gushing fountains, and ponds with ornamental swans. If there was a drought, it was a well-hidden one. Margaret's poker face didn't flinch when Alex asked why the HOA hadn't just asked for permission. "We didn't think you'd understand the urgency," she replied, with a cold smile. "Besides, your grandfather always understood his duty to the community." That document Margaret waved around might have looked intimidating, but Alex knew something was off. After hiring a lawyer to review it, the truth came into sharp focus. The easement, written in a time when such agreements were scrawled in ambiguous legalese, allowed the HOA access to dig one emergency well for the shared benefit of the surrounding community in the event of a verified water crisis. What Alex saw on the property was not one well. It was 6. Maybe more. They were spaced out with precision, marked with surveying tape, and installed with pumps far too industrial for casual neighborhood use. It didn't take a detective to see that someone was pushing the boundaries of a flimsy clause for personal gain. The HOA wasn't trying to save water, they were trying to control it. The deeper Alex dug, the more it became clear, Margaret and her allies had no intention of stopping at just one well. They were expanding. They were monetizing. And worst of all, they were doing it under the illusion of neighborly concern and environmental necessity. The pieces clicked into place when Alex took a closer look inside the gates of Pine Grove. There, beyond the suspiciously lush lawns and pristine gardens, were signs of opulence that simply didn't add up during an alleged drought. A grand central lake, complete with a faux waterfall and imported koi fish, sparkled in the sunlight. Ornamental fountains shot arcs of water over marble courtyards. A community clubhouse boasted an indoor pool, a mist-cooled tennis court, and a decorative moat. None of this said, "Emergency." This was extravagance, funded by stolen groundwater. Alex took drone footage, photographs, even samples. But the most damning discovery came late one afternoon when they followed the network of hoses and buried piping through the underbrush and found that it didn't just lead to the HOA's water features. It extended far beyond the boundaries of Pine Grove, toward a fenced construction site labeled Future Home of Pine Valley Premium Outlets. Suddenly, the theft wasn't just a neighborhood issue. It was a full-blown scheme, commercial, exploitative, and illegal. Absolutely. Here are the next 5 long-form paragraphs continuing with a rising sense of dread and determination. Alex traced the web of pipes through a small thicket behind their grandfather's barn, down a shallow ravine, and up a ridge that overlooked the nearby development site. What had once been forest had been razed, revealing bulldozers, scaffolding, and a billboard boasting glossy renderings of Pine Valley Premium Outlets, coming soon, emblazoned over a row of boutique storefronts. The water lines, cleverly buried and disguised, led directly to a large underground cistern hidden beneath the site. It was no coincidence. Alex's property, rich in groundwater and previously untouched, was being siphoned to sustain this commercial monstrosity. This wasn't just unauthorized use. This was environmental looting for profit. Margaret and the HOA had masked their greed behind a humanitarian facade, but in reality, they were co-conspirators in a water trafficking operation that violated county regulations, environmental codes, and basic decency. And worse still, their actions were inflating property values for HOA members, making the rich even richer while exploiting a resource that was never theirs to begin with. Alex wasted no time gathering every piece of documentation they could find: photos, maps, drone footage, witness statements. They met with attorneys specializing in land use and environmental law. But the moment Alex's lawyer filed an injunction against the HOA's activities, a wall of quiet resistance emerged. County clerks were slow to respond. Permits that should have been accessible were misplaced. Court schedules were mysteriously pushed back. It didn't take long for the lawyer to uncover the rot. Margaret Wilson wasn't just an HOA president. She was a former county planning commissioner with a network of allies still embedded in the bureaucracy. Her husband, a real estate lobbyist, had once sat on the board that approved the outlet mall. Her brother-in-law managed the local water rights database. What Alex faced wasn't just a greedy HOA. It was an entrenched political machine, decades in the making, with tentacles wrapped around every institution that was supposed to protect the public interest. The legal battle was uphill, expensive, and emotionally exhausting. And yet, Alex refused to yield. After weeks of delays, threats, and procedural dead ends, something inside Alex snapped. The law, it seemed, was a slow and fickle ally. But cement was not. In a moment of clarity, or desperation, Alex began planning a direct strike. If the wells were illegal, then they had no right to operate. And if the HOA wanted to play dirty, Alex was more than willing to meet them in the mud. Working alone and under the radar, they rented a concrete mixer under a friend's name, bought bags of fast-setting cement from different hardware stores to avoid suspicion, and collected metal scraps, broken rebar, and discarded tools. The plan was risky, but precise: destroy the wells from within, rendering them unusable and too costly to replace. It wouldn't undo the damage already done, but it would stop the bleeding. And more importantly, it would send a message that this land, his grandfather's land, would not be exploited any longer. It was a dangerous line to cross, but in Alex's mind, it was the only line left. Under the cover of night, dressed in black and wearing a headlamp, Alex began the operation. Each well was a metallic mouth gaping into the earth, fed by silent machinery that hummed like the breath of some sleeping beast. Alex worked methodically. One bag of cement at a time, poured directly down the shaft, followed by metal debris to clog the intake and choke the pumps. The first well took nearly an hour. The second, just 40 minutes. By the time dawn crept over the treetops, 4 of the 6 wells had been disabled beyond repair. Alex buried the evidence, tools, gloves, receipts, in a ditch behind the barn. The air reeked of sweat, diesel, and cement dust, but there was also a strange sense of satisfaction. The land was still wounded, yes, but at least it was no longer bleeding. Alex collapsed in bed, muscles trembling, mind racing, knowing full well that retaliation would come, and soon. But the truth was finally in motion, and now it was only a matter of how far things would go before someone, anyone, listened. Retaliation arrived faster than expected. Within 48 hours, Alex received a series of formal notices from the HOA, each more absurd than the last. One cited unauthorized vegetation on the property, a reference to the natural grass and native shrubs that had grown wild for years. Another accused Alex of failing to maintain curb appeal, despite the fact that the property wasn't even within Pine Grove's legal jurisdiction. But the most disturbing was a letter demanding compensation for damaged community assets, accompanied by a veiled threat of legal action. Alex laughed bitterly. So now they admitted the wells belonged to them? Clearly, the HOA was feeling the sting, and they were fighting back the only way they knew how: intimidation through bureaucracy. Margaret Wilson made no attempt to hide her disdain when she confronted Alex at the property line days later. "You're playing a dangerous game," she said, voice low and controlled. "You don't know the people you're messing with." But Alex just stared at her with steely resolve, the scent of fresh cement still clinging to their jacket. "Neither do you," they replied. Just when Alex began to feel like they were standing alone against a machine too big to break, an unexpected knock came at the door. Frank and Donna Miller, a retired couple who had lived on the fringe of Pine Grove Estates for over 20 years, stood on the porch, nervous but determined. Frank, a former civil engineer, had once served on the HOA's infrastructure committee before quietly stepping down years ago. "We know what they're doing," Donna said, eyes darting toward the tree line. "And it's not just your land. They've done this before. Small things, quiet things. But this is bigger." Frank pulled out a folder filled with meeting transcripts, financial reports, and handwritten notes. He had kept copies of everything, including a detailed plan Margaret had presented in a closed-door session about expanding water access for community-enhancing partnerships, a euphemism for supplying water to developers. The documents mentioned drilling strategies, payoffs, and even the name of the shell company funneling the profits. Frank and Donna had kept their mouths shut for years, but watching what was happening to Alex, and knowing the groundwater was being depleted to inflate property values and mall investments, was finally too much to stomach. "They think they own everything," Frank muttered. "But they don't. Not yet." Armed with the Miller's evidence and his own mountain of documentation, Alex filed a formal complaint with the county's Department of Environmental Oversight. This time, the response couldn't be buried or delayed. The complaint triggered a mandatory site inspection, and when inspectors arrived, they found more than just unauthorized wells. They uncovered chemical leakage, improper drainage systems, and unregistered utility conduits. It was more than just an HOA misstep. It was systemic abuse of land and water rights. Officials marked the area for an environmental impact review, which halted all active drilling immediately. Margaret and her board were livid, of course, claiming Alex had fabricated the entire ordeal in a personal vendetta. But the tone began to shift. The county's investigation team wasn't made up of Alex's neighbors. They were professionals, some of whom were visibly disturbed by the scope of the operation. "This isn't just a zoning issue anymore," one of them muttered. "This is ecological fraud." And suddenly, the HOA's iron grip on local systems began to loosen under the scrutiny of people who couldn't be intimidated. Things escalated even further when a detective from the county's Environmental Crimes Unit, Detective Nora Delgado, was assigned to the case. She showed up unannounced, a no-nonsense woman in a blazer dusted with road dirt, and asked to walk the property. She wasn't there to make small talk. She took photos, asked sharp questions, and barely blinked when Alex explained how the wells had been sabotaged. "Concrete?" she asked, a single eyebrow raised. "Interesting choice. Not exactly subtle." But she didn't press further. Her focus was on tracing the money and authorization. Within days, she had subpoenaed HOA records, contractor payment logs, and internal emails. What she found made the situation undeniable. False drought declarations filed with the county, forged signatures on permit applications, and a clear paper trail linking HOA funds to the developers behind Pine Valley Premium Outlets. When Delgado confronted Margaret Wilson, the woman's composure cracked for the first time. And while she still clung to her narrative of community betterment, the evidence was now undeniable. The fraud was wide, deep, and disturbingly coordinated. It only took one leak to turn the tide. An anonymous source, likely someone from the inspector's office, sent documents and video footage to the local news station. Within 48 hours, the story hit the evening broadcast. HOA accused of water theft, fraud, and illegal development ties, the headline blared. Footage of Alex's sabotaged wells played on loop, while Margaret's voice echoed hollowly in a pre-recorded HOA meeting. "This project will ensure our community thrives, even if sacrifices must be made." Reporters flocked to Pine Grove's front gates. Protesters began lining the sidewalks. Other homeowners, who had been previously complacent or unaware, suddenly had questions, many of them angry. Why had dues increased last quarter? Why had their water bills remained suspiciously low when nearby neighborhoods had imposed strict conservation rules? Online forums buzzed with speculation, frustration, and support for Alex. The narrative had shifted. No longer was Alex just a property owner fighting an overreaching HOA. They had become a symbol of whistleblowing courage in the face of organized corruption. The next town hall meeting, held under pressure from the mayor's office and live-streamed by local media, chaos erupted. Pine Grove's recreation center was packed wall-to-wall with furious residents, stunned officials, and anxious reporters. Margaret Wilson took the stage flanked by fellow board members, attempting to deliver a carefully scripted apology. But the crowd wasn't in a forgiving mood. Questions flew like darts. Why was our money used to fund illegal wells? What else are you hiding? Is the HOA bankrupt? Tension boiled over when one board member, visibly sweating, broke ranks and began blaming Margaret directly, claiming she had acted unilaterally and manipulated the others into silence. Another admitted he'd been threatened with losing his home if he spoke up. Factions formed on the floor, shouting matches broke out, and the live stream was cut briefly when an enraged homeowner knocked over a microphone stand. Alex stood at the back, arms crossed, watching the entire thing collapse under the weight of its own lies. The truth was finally undeniable, and it was tearing Pine Grove apart from the inside out. The fallout from the town hall was swift and unforgiving. Within a week, the county district attorney filed formal charges against Margaret Wilson and several key HOA board members. The charges ranged from environmental fraud and embezzlement to falsifying public documents and illegal resource extraction. Margaret was arrested at her home in full view of news cameras, her once impeccable demeanor replaced with a mix of rage and fear. As the investigation widened, it uncovered a web of corruption that stretched beyond Pine Grove. Contractors paid off to look the other way, developers cutting side deals, even a few minor county officials who quietly resigned before indictments landed. For the first time in years, accountability cracked through the cement walls of privilege. Alex watched from the sidelines, not with vengeance, but with a quiet, bone-deep sense of justice. The land had been violated, yes. But now the violators were facing real consequences. The legal system, once sluggish and indifferent, was finally moving with force. The same concrete that had sealed those wells had now symbolically buried a corrupt empire. In the weeks following the arrests, the Pine Grove community entered a state of collective reckoning. Residents who had once looked the other way, or even benefited from the excess, began re-evaluating what kind of neighborhood they had built. HOA meetings were no longer exclusive affairs but open forums filled with soul-searching and debate. Many came to Alex with sincere apologies, no longer dismissive of their concerns, but humbled. A group of local families, including Frank and Donna Miller, proposed something radical, turning the once exploited land into a nature preserve. It was a gesture of atonement and hope, a way to heal both the physical land and the social rift Margaret had created. Alex agreed, under one condition. The land would remain open, protected, and preserved, not for profit, but for education, conservation, and remembrance. Volunteers soon arrived to clean the area, plant native species, and erect signs explaining the story. The transformation was slow, but powerful. What had once been a battleground became a place of rebirth. The land, finally, was being honored instead of used. Rather than removing the cement-filled wells, Alex made a bold decision: they would stay. Not as wounds, but as monuments. With help from the community and a local artist, each well was marked with a plaque detailing the story behind it, how it was drilled illegally, how it was sealed, and what it represented. The metal scraps embedded in the concrete were arranged into sculptures, twisted tools and rusted pipes transformed into abstract warnings against greed. School groups came to visit. Environmental activists held talks on water rights and sustainability. Journalists continued to reference the case in articles about HOA reform and local governance accountability. These wells, once a symbol of theft and exploitation, became a living reminder that vigilance matters, that land and water aren't just resources to be sold, but parts of a deeper legacy. People began calling the area the sealed ground, a name that stuck.